The principle of utility. According to the principle of utility, actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness, wrong as they tend to produce the reverse of happiness. Another way the utilitarians state this view is to say that actions are right if they produce the greatest amount of happiness overall. The utilitarians' emphasis on the overall happiness is extremely important to keep in mind when we're talking about utilitarianism. According to the utilitarian, it's not my happiness that counts, but the overall happiness. So whenever I'm going to take an action or want to perform some action and ask myself, is this action moral or not? I can't just ask, does this action benefit me? What I have to ask is, does this benefit everyone in general? As the principle of utility states, this benefit we're discussing is happiness. So that immediately leads to the question, what does the utilitarian mean by happiness? Happiness for the utilitarian really boils down to pleasure or pleasurable sensations of some sort. To say that I'm better off means there's more pleasure in my life, and to say that I'm worse off means that there's less pleasure in my life or more pain in my life. The utilitarian emphasis on pleasurable sensations and painful sensations naturally brings up the question as to whether all pleasures are equally good and all pains are equally bad. So for instance, let's say I get a lot of pleasure out of playing Xbox. Is the pleasure I get from playing Xbox just as good as the pleasure someone might get from listening to a Bach concerto? Some utilitarians, like Jeremy Bentham, held that all pleasures or all pains were essentially the same. If something gave you pleasure, it was just as good as any other thing that gave you the same amount of pleasure. This is referred to as quantitative utilitarianism or quantitative hedonism. Many utilitarians and non-utilitarians have found this quantitative approach to happiness somewhat offensive. The idea that all pleasures are equally good just seems intuitively wrong. John Stuart Mill, for instance, believed that there were differences between pleasures. Mill said that it may be true that we have a desire for sort of base pleasures, but human beings are more complex than, say, animals. And so Mill argues that there are a second set of pleasures or types of pleasures, which he refers to as qualitative pleasures. According to Mill, there are certain activities that human beings engage in that have a greater quality of pleasure rather than quantity of pleasure. So for instance, playing a musical instrument may be something that gives me a qualitatively higher pleasure than some other activity I may engage in. And according to Mill, given my higher faculties, I'm going to choose that higher pleasure rather than go for more of the lower, baser pleasures. Regardless if the utilitarian is talking about quantitative pleasures or qualitative pleasures, and utilitarians do in fact disagree about whether we should be focusing on qualitative or quantitative pleasures, all utilitarians agree that consequences are what matter. Moral theories that are concerned with outcomes or ends are referred to as teleological theories. Theories that don't actually concern themselves with the consequences of actions are deontological theories. We'll be dealing with the Kantian theory, which is a deontological theory, in the next section of the reading pack. Aside from the qualitative and quantitative distinction made by utilitarians, there's another distinction often made, and that deals with the application of the principle of utility. Many utilitarians disagree exactly how we're supposed to apply the principle of utility to our actions. Some utilitarians believe that each individual action should be put up for scrutiny against the principle of utility. For example, imagine my daughter comes to me with a picture that she's just drawn and asks me, "Do you like my picture?" If I'm a good utilitarian, I may ask myself, okay, should I lie to my daughter? Lying, obviously, in this case, will make her happy. I'm sure my daughter doesn't want to hear that her picture is not particularly good. And so for the act utilitarian, I should ask myself whether, in this particular case, I ought to lie. Would lying be acceptable? For the act utilitarian, as long as this individual act would maximize utility, then the action is morally justified. Many utilitarians are uncomfortable with this sort of scenario. Many utilitarians want to say that lying is almost never morally appropriate. So while maybe lying to my daughter might be something that I would do to save her feelings, many utilitarians want to say that lying in general is something that we're not going to be allowed to do. So how do utilitarians handle this situation? Well, many utilitarians argue that we're not supposed to apply the principle of utility to individual actions, but we're to apply the principle to groups of actions. So the only time I actually refer to the principle of utility itself is when I'm attempting to determine which rules I ought to generally follow. So lying, for instance, is a rule that if generally followed would lead to very bad consequences. If most people lied, or people lied all the time, that would lead to negative outcomes. So the rule utilitarian might say that in general, lying is something I shouldn't do because it violates a rule that would lead to less utility in the world, or less happiness in the world. According to rule utilitarians, there are two occasions in which I want to appeal directly to the principle of utility. The first occasion is when I'm trying to determine which rules society ought to generally follow. So if I'm asking myself which rules should I make as part of my moral code, I might appeal to the principle of utility. Lying, stealing, cheating, killing are all rules, or prohibitions against those actions are all rules, that generally followed would lead to more people being better off than worse off. And so those are the types of rules I want to encourage in my society. And in those cases, when I'm attempting to figure out those rules and any other number of rules, I'm going to appeal directly to utility and ask, will this increase or decrease happiness? The second occasion in which I want to appeal directly to the principle of utility is when those rules that I formulated come into conflict. So if I have two rules and each rule seems to tell me to do something different when applied to a particular situation, I might ask myself, okay, should I follow rule A or should I follow rule B? On those occasions, I'm going to then ask myself, which of the two rules, if generally followed, would maximize utility? And so I might say, well, in this instance, rule A seems to lead to better outcomes than following rule B, and so I go with rule A. As with all moral theories, utilitarianism is not without its share of problems. Depending on which type of utilitarian you are, you encounter different types of problems. So I want to deal first with the act utilitarian. Let's assume I've endorsed the act utilitarian view of morality. What are some of the problems I might encounter? The first thing I might find troubling as an act utilitarian deals with the outcomes of my actions. Remember, the act utilitarian is telling me in each individual case, in each action that I'm about to take, I have to ask myself, will this action maximize overall happiness? If that's the case, this means that I have to know whether or not the consequences of my actions do in fact increase or decrease happiness. But this is an extremely difficult thing to determine. We don't often know whether the outcome of our actions are going to be good or bad. Some actions we can anticipate being bad, some we can anticipate being good, but we're never 100% sure. Another problem with outcomes is the fact that this approach to morality makes morality extremely onerous. In other words, if I'm an act utilitarian, I have to ask whether each individual action I take maximizes utility. But the utilitarian doesn't restrict these actions. So for instance, when I wake up in the morning and I go brush my teeth, I would normally think I'm not doing anything moral or immoral. On a utilitarian account, or specifically an act utilitarian account, I might have to ask myself, have I used my resources in a way that maximizes overall utility? So when I open up the tube of toothpaste, did I buy a cheap tube of toothpaste or a more expensive tube of toothpaste with the extra whitening and cleaning properties? If I've used that money to buy a more expensive tube of toothpaste rather than donating it, say, to feed the hungry, it may on an act utilitarian account mean that I've actually done something immoral. Another problem with act utilitarianism is a variation on what's known as the free rider problem. A free rider is someone who takes advantage of everyone else doing the right thing in order to gain some benefit for themselves. In the utilitarian version of the free rider problem, the individual that's not following the rules is not actually benefiting themselves so much as they are benefiting everyone in general by not following the rules that, if generally followed, would lead to more people being better off than worse off. On page 6 of your reading packet, the book states, and this is the third objection, a third objection to act utilitarianism arises in situations in which virtually everyone must follow the same rules in order to achieve a high level of utility, but even greater utility can be achieved if a few people do not follow the rules. So the problem with act utilitarianism is that sometimes individuals, a large number of individuals, may all have to do a particular action in order to achieve a good outcome, but even in those cases, a little more good may be done by some people violating the actions that they ought to generally do. So you have an internal conflict in the act utilitarian's sort of view. Sometimes I'm supposed to follow what everyone else is doing because that will maximize overall utility with my action. But at the same time, I may be told to not take the same actions that everyone else is taking in order to maximize utility. The Medicaid example in your reading packet, I think, gives a good example of this sort of problem for the act utilitarian. A final problem with act utilitarianism deals with the problems involved with promising and obligations generally. According to the act utilitarian, each individual action has to be looked at and asked whether or not it will maximize overall utility. But clearly there are cases when keeping a promise leads to a certain disutility. Again, the example given in your reading packet gives a nice example of this problem. And I quote, "Suppose that a surgeon promises a patient that only he will perform an operation, then allows a well-qualified resident to perform part of it. Suppose that all goes well and the patient never discovers that the promise was not kept. The outcome for the patient is exactly the same as if the surgeon had kept the promise. From the point of view of the act utilitarian, there is nothing wrong with the surgeon's failure to keep it. Yet critics charge that there is something wrong, that in making the promise the surgeon took on an obligation. Act utilitarians in general have problems with obligations. As long as the outcome remains the same, as long as there's no net change in utility, or utility is maximized, then keeping a promise is something that's permissible, but not obligatory. As long as my action can increase utility, in fact, a completely different utility, maybe not associated with the person I made the promise to, then that action is still morally acceptable, and breaking the promise was morally acceptable. Moving now to the problems with rule utilitarianism, the first problem deals with the conflicts of rules. One problem the rule utilitarian might have is what to do in situations in which we have two rules that give equally good or equally bad outcomes. In such a case, I can't appeal to the principle of utility directly because by definition, both rules do exactly the same thing, have exactly the same outcomes. So as your book notes, sometimes a physician may be faced with two courses of action, both which lead to a good outcome, but there's no way to determine which of the two actions the physician ought to take. Another problem with rule utilitarianism deals with the number of rules. For the rule utilitarian, I'm supposed to formulate rules that, if generally followed, will maximize utility. But it may come across the problem of there being simply too many rules, that each situation generates a new rule, and these rules can't be kept straight. And so for the rule utilitarian, I might say, rather than a general principle that I can appeal to, it requires that I have this large set of rules which becomes far too cumbersome to help me in any given situation. Finally, the most troubling problem for the rule utilitarian deals with consistency. Remember that the rule utilitarian says we should never appeal directly to the principle of utility, but simply follow rules that maximize utility. The question for the rule utilitarian is, what should I do in a situation in which following the rule does not maximize utility? In such a case, the utilitarian has two options. One, I can continue to follow the rule, even though following that rule won't be maximizing utility, which of course goes against the central premise of utilitarianism. My other option is I can simply violate the rule and maximize utility. In such case, I might ask, why am I not then just an act utilitarian? If I follow the rules and the rules aren't maximizing utility, then I'm not being a good utilitarian. I'm not maximizing overall happiness. On the other hand, if I violate the rule, then what good is the rule in the first place? Shouldn't I just be looking at each individual action and maximizing utility whenever I get the chance? So one problem that's brought up by a number of philosophers is that rule utilitarianism seems to collapse into act utilitarianism. So following rules might be generally good, but in reality what we're really doing is asking in each individual instance, am I maximizing utility? Of course then, if we fall back on act utilitarianism, then we've got all those problems that we have been discussing about act utilitarianism. Given the problems that are encountered in both act and rule utilitarianism, some philosophers have advocated something called preference utility. So rather than focusing on happiness or pleasure and pain in the way the act and rule utilitarian do, some philosophers have argued that what we ought to do is attempt to maximize individual preferences. So, for instance, if I prefer to lead a life in a certain way, I want to engage in certain activities, pursue a certain type of career, these all constitute the various preferences I have in my life. And if more of those preferences are satisfied rather than less, then I'm made better off. For the purposes in the course, we won't go into preference utility, which has a whole host of problems. So I ask you just to make sure you've read that section in your text, or I should say in the reading packet, on page 9 and 10, and just to be familiar with that.